The action of our story takes place in 1963 in the Church of Perugia. It happened on Christmas Day, a day when chanting and Christmas songs were being sung everywhere. The main character thought that this would be the happiest day of his life, but everything turned out to be completely wrong. We can notice that in this church there was a huge number of corpses, but suddenly someone's hand reaches out from under the rest of the people, at which point the priest turns around to see who is moving there. Suddenly he noticed that it was a little boy who was covered in blood and stretched out his hand and begged to be saved. At this moment, some man immediately stated that he would deal with this boy while the priest's face changed. That man also stated that he had no idea how that boy managed to survive, but he wouldn't get out of here alive anyway. But the priest magnanimously stops his subject and says he shouldn't do anything to this boy, naturally a bit surprised here. Then after a couple minutes, the priest walked towards the surviving boy and stood in front of him and began to scrutinize him. At that moment, the boy was still begging the priest to help him and save his life. At that moment, the boy was on the verge of death. In the boy's opinion, the priest was... And here was the savior. He stretched out his hands to him and looked at him as if priests were the real personification of some deity. Then the priest reached out his hand to the boy and suddenly grabbed him by the hair. With an evil look, he looked at him and said that for the boy, a much better outcome would be a simple death, and therefore he did not understand why he asked not to be killed. Then the boy justifies his desire to live by the fact that if he dies right now, everything will be over for him. And according to his own words, he would like to do his best until his hour comes. It turns out that it was from that very moment that the protagonist began to live in a family of vampires. The action of the story takes us 10 years forward to 1973, namely September 2nd. There at the Ritz Hotel in room 402, a man was seen wearing no clothes, and the sounds of someone touching something wet could be heard. It turned out that these sounds were made by Eugene White, who at this point was 20 years old and sucking on someone's chupa chupa, at which point that man lifted his head and said that the boy was doing very well. During this process, the boy says that the pastor was detained on a hot trail and he found out about it at the prosecutor's office. He also assumes that he will have a very, very hard time, which this man agreed with, because as it turned out, he is a judge. He's sure the pastor will have a hard time. He's the one who'll be sentencing him, which is just what he expects from Mr. Judge. At this point, the judge says that he will support Eugene in whatever he does, and also declares that he truly loves the guy. But at this point, he sticks his hand under his pillow and asks if he can truly believe in love, whereupon the guy pulls out a gun from under his pillow. After a while, he was already on top and pointing the gun at the judge, asked, did he really think the guy would really reciprocate? Naturally, the judge was not happy about this outcome and called the guy names. But Eugene just put a pillow to his face and said goodbye and fired a shot. At this point, the young man doesn't even realize how the judge didn't realize that the guy he was spending his time with was sent by the very pastor the judge was supposed to judge. At this point, Eugene even states that this is what happens to people. I don't believe what they want to believe. And then he puts on his robe and goes to the bathroom. There, he began to taste the blood that had leaked out of the judge, but suddenly found his throat dry and realized that he urgently needed a master. After a while, Eugene Horror was in his master's room. This room looked like a real torture room, but Eugene even liked it. And it turned out that the pastor spanked the protagonist as many as 28 times. But it's not enough for the guy, and he wants him to do it even more times. Well, it turns out that it wasn't like that in the beginning. And before Master truly took care of him, at which point the pastor interrupts and asks the guy what about the assignment he got. At this point about now, he feels more than superior since he now has the opportunity to sacrifice himself for his master. The pastor then stated that apparently young Eugene still had not learned to restrain his instrument and had succumbed to his provocations. The pastor also says that he noticed how out of his tool what is inherent only to humans immediately began to refute this and stated that it was not true at all. Naturally, the pastor did not believe it at first, but the boy immediately declared that he was telling the truth, because only his master can make him truly happy. Immediately after these words, the pastor threw something on the floor and said that all this is certainly nice, and said that this reward would be enough for the young man for completing the task. Naturally, he was surprised, but the pastor only said that he would have to clean up after himself. At which point, Eugene lowered his head and wondered if this was really his reward for accomplishing such a difficult mission. Suddenly, he became angry and went up to the pastor and begged him to look at him, at which point the young man even grabbed the pastor by the arm. Immediately afterward, pastor sat down across from the guy and began to watch him having a great time, at which point the young man called the pastor his master. During this, the boy looked at the pastor and reiterated that he loved his master while the man felt no emotion. Suddenly, he touched his foot to the pastor's beautiful shoes and said that he wanted to feel his master. But suddenly, the pastor abruptly yanked the rope that was tied by the protagonist and said that somehow he didn't feel his love for him at all. In the pastor's opinion, the protagonist began to behave too arrogantly, immediately after which he touched his foot to him and asked, "Does the guy really want exactly this?" After a while, Eugene said he could prove his love so much that the pastor would have no extra reason or power to deny the fact. Sometime later, the main character is already in a music lesson where he is learning to play the piano. The teacher asked him to play a composition by Debussy called Isle of Joy. According to the teacher, he was inspired to create this composition by the painting of the pilgrimage on the island of Cypheru, and also stated that this island is called the Island of Love because it is believed that Aphrodite lived on it. At this point, he also notices how stiff Eugene is and asks the guy to relax and try to convey the subtlety of the composition. The teacher asks the protagonist to think about how to express the delight of the feeling of falling in love, at which point, in order to accurately convey his feelings, the protagonist begins to recall some moments from his life. Suddenly, he remembers outwardly the kiss with the pastor and his words about the boy not being afraid of anything. At that moment, the pastor said that just as the sun ruled the day and the moon ruled the night, so the body would be frozen between death and life. At that moment, lines began to form around them that were like witchcraft. These memories made Eugene Play still excited. He also remembered that at that moment, the pastor's body and his body seemed to be cut by something. And also something else happened. It turns out that at that moment, the ceiling of the church they were in exploded, which naturally scared the guy very much. At that moment, the pastor was looking at him. I noticed that the wounds that were forming on his body began to heal. Naturally, he was very much surprised, but suddenly the wounds on the pastor's body began to become deeper and bled a lot. Naturally, all the vampires who were also at the event were very frightened at what was happening to their father and leader. According to the people around him, it was too frivolous. After all, they even said that this soul unification ritual would not be successful. At this moment, Eugene was very much frightened and even started crying. He immediately pleaded guilty and stated in public that he was responsible for the incident and tried to run up to the pastor. But at that moment, he was grabbed by other vampires, and the pastor ordered the boy to stop. He said that he trusted the young boy was just his mistake. Naturally, the protagonist does not agree with this and immediately began to beg his pastor to give him another chance to prove himself. He literally begged him for it. But then the pastor said that this is not true at all, and even that the boy does not love him. At this point, the young man began to play already in a completely different way on the piano that drew the attention of his teacher to it. At this point, the man stopped the protagonist and asked why he was playing Debussy in this way, and said that if he couldn't concentrate, he should stop. At this point, the guy's face looked very scared, but the teacher just brought him back from the classroom and asked that the guy go out and get some fresh air. After the young man was in the hallway, he realized that if he returned to the classroom now, his teacher would be even more angry with him. Naturally, in order not to anger his teacher, he decided to do as he advised and went outside. After the protagonist did this, he began to knead his fingers, realizing that he should try harder. The young man realizes that he can't concentrate in class because of his memories of the past, and so he decides that he must definitely live up to all of his master's expectations. After a short walk, Eugene decided that he should go back to rehearsal to improve his piano skills, when suddenly a rock flew into his head. Naturally, the guy got very angry about what was happening and immediately asked who did it. At this point, you could see the anger on his face and even the fangs coming through. It turns out it was done by a group of young guys led by their captain. The latter immediately stated that he had just committed, so he waited and asked the protagonist to return the ball to him. But the protagonist was not going to give in, and instead of passing the ball to that guy, just kicked him while thinking that all these people were really pissing him off. Naturally, Captain was not happy that the guy showed such disrespect to him, and hitting him in the chest with his fist asked everyone else just to look at this idiot. It turns out Captain is also a vampire like the main character. Naturally, the captain was immediately angry and even called the protagonist an ordinary bloodsucker, while the other vampires did not understand who it was at all, and only remembered that the protagonist was sent here by his sponsor. They called him a monkey. At this point, Eugene was very angry at being neglected and grabbed the captain's arm and asked him why he dared to address him in such a manner. At that moment, the captain sharply jerked his hand, saying that the boy had no right to touch him. Naturally, the young man was very much surprised, and from such a sudden movement began to fall. At this point, everyone else was watching, and the protagonist fell right into the pond that was nearby. Naturally, he was disturbed by what had happened, but the captain only said that the protagonist was in the face of the seaweed. Then the young vampires began to ridicule the protagonist, saying that he could just live quietly and peacefully in this swamp. Naturally, everyone began to ridicule the protagonist, but Eugene was not at all happy about this outcome of the situation, and only looked at David with chagrin and anger. Immediately after this incident, the protagonist went to the laundromat. Because all his clothes were soaked and stank of swamp, he was very angry because he did not understand how David dares to behave like this with others. The protagonist even decides that as soon as he gets permission from the owner, he will immediately kill David because he is already quite fed up with him. But suddenly, when he was about to take a shower to get rid of the foul odor, it was as if he thought someone was in the shower as well. Naturally, the protagonist looked out, but he did not see anyone. Instead, he heard some strange noises from the room that was next door and decided to see what was going on there. Naturally, he didn't understand what these people were doing here. So he covered himself with a towel and decided to head over there to see what was going on. At the moment when the main character reached the stall from which a strange noise was heard, he was very much surprised. It turns out there were two other guys who were having fun together. Of course, the main character was amazed by what he saw and did not understand how they can only do it right here. Naturally, he immediately started judging you for watching these two young men and just decided to go back to his bathing room. But at that moment, one of the guys opened the door and, looking at the protagonist, immediately called out to him. Of course, Eugene was very surprised that they were interrupted from the process and turned around to see what these vampires wanted from him. It turned out that these young men were not averse to making another friend of their own, and so one of them immediately asked Eugene if he would like to join them. At first, Eugene didn't even understand what this guy meant, but after a little thought, it all became pretty clear to him. Naturally, the main character was very much surprised by such a proposal, and even in some way embarrassed by the surprise that just happened. He didn't reply, but thought he wouldn't join these guys because he didn't look like a crazy person. At this point, he decided to just leave the place. And from that stall suddenly looked out, and the second guy, and asked the first guy what he was looking at. But he covered his eyes and said that he just saw a man who passed by them, at which point his friend asked the blonde to focus better on him. Immediately after that, they started kissing passionately, which the protagonist naturally paid attention to. He was very happy with what he saw. But suddenly, as if he was thinking about something, it turns out that Eugene has reflected on the fact that his master may never kiss him with the same passion and love as he does between these two young men. Suddenly, he decided to turn around and take another look at them as he was suddenly very surprised at what he saw. At that moment, both guys had come out of their cubicle in full height and were helping each other out. At this point, in order to avoid an awkward situation, the protagonist goes back into his cubicle, but realizes that the more he thinks about it, the more absurd it all seems to him. He starts blaming himself for what happened and doesn't realize who in their right mind would even peep at something like this. In his opinion, it's totally wrong. After all, he realizes that normal people in the shower are having fun spending their time. After he finished showering, Eugene quickly dressed and hurriedly left the room, asking the boys to do their business at home instead of here. Naturally, they heard this appeal to themselves, and then one of them said that they were caught and asks what to do. After all, he understands that most likely their school may go rumors, but the second guy is confident and asks the first does not worry. It turns out that he is not worried about the rumors that may spread about them, because he assumes that the main character will not tell anyone anything and nobody. After a certain amount of time, the protagonist was already in front of his master. It turns out that he began to remember the day of the ceremony that failed. He stated that then, during the soul fusion, he had fully proved his love for Eugen, unlike the one who in return failed to do the same for his master. Naturally, this fact made the master very angry, and he even asked the protagonist to simply admit that it was true, while the master, firmly holding the protagonist, said that even so, he would never let him go from under his influence. At this point, the host also says that apparently Eugene is also not really trying to get out of his hands, and so the relationship between them will remain the same. But the young vampire said he was beginning to notice how his master no longer said he loved him. And so he wondered if his master had apparently grown tired of him and wanted to leave him. Naturally, Eugene realizes that his master may lie and say he loves him, but he just wants his master to hug him like he did between those two guys back then. But suddenly, Eugene once again realizes that the master will never give him such a bright love as between those two guys. He even started crying from this, while the master asked why he should let Eugene go. At this point, the young man realizes that his master no longer loves him, but he wonders how he can get out of this situation. Eugene is not clear what to do, and whether the master will be happy if he gives him as much love as he wants, and whether he will give him another chance. After a while, the master decides that he must punish Eugene for not trying hard enough and not living up to his expectations, and taking the whip. He says he will help the boy to realize how deeply he was wrong in not trying to the end. Immediately after the master punished Eugene, he gave him new tasks that the protagonist must fulfill until the evening. According to the master, this man is planning to escape, and therefore it is necessary to deal with him, after which the master wishes the protagonist to spend well this night, hinting at successful fulfillment of the mission. Naturally, the young man also decided to look and for whom he could not longer be with his master, and decided to look at the profile of this person. It turns out he needs to remove it to protect the information. After a while, the action is again transferred to the Hotel Ritz, but this time in 506 room. There, on September 8th at 12 a.m., the main character decided to perform his task. Turns out he attacked the man who, after a couple of actions, was very surprised that Eugene wasn't dead yet. He looked very scared. As Eugene approached him, naturally, the young man asked, "Does this man really care why he didn't die?" Abruptly started to approach him, at which point the man decided to grab his gun. He immediately pointed straight at the protagonist, while he told that man to only worry about his health and not to worry about him in any way. Right after that, the main character showed his fangs and wondered if the man had already guessed who he really was. Then, from the fright after seeing the man, dropped his gun on the ground and loudly realized that in front of him is an unusual person and the most real vampire. The protagonist, in contrast, was very calm. While the man began to angrily call someone to his aid, after Eugene presented a gun to his head, he also stated that he was ready to tell everything. But Eugene was not interested in his words and immediately shot the man in the head on the grounds that he was lying, because according to the guy before the click of death, a man can say anything, but in his opinion, those words were worth nothing. After the young vampire had completed his task, he looked at his victim and realized how fragile and stupid mortals were. Suddenly, he heard an extraneous noise coming from the hallway. At that moment, someone else was there, and was very surprised that everyone was dead. Naturally, the main character decided not to give himself away, and realizing that someone is heading straight to this room, decided to quickly run out to the balcony to avoid being noticed. Immediately after he did this, another young man entered the room who was very upset that this man was also dead. But suddenly, at that moment, the protagonist began to realize whose voice it was. It turns out that this person who came in here is the same young man from the shower stall who called the protagonist to join their fun. At this moment, he looked very angry because they needed this man. Of course, the protagonist realized that the guy who walked into the room was the young man from the shower, and so he suddenly wondered what he was doing here. Well, suddenly, he moved a little, which naturally the man in the room immediately noticed. He noticed that there was someone on the balcony and decided to check who was there. At this moment, Eugene was very wary and didn't understand how he should act in such a situation. He tried not to make any sound and even breathed more slowly in order to calm down and not to make too much noise, thus attracting attention. But realizing that the situation is almost hopeless, Eugene decided to hide from the balcony for his own safety. As soon as the guy from the room came out to the balcony, he began to carefully examine everything that was nearby. Naturally, seeing nothing, he began to assume that it seems that the man who committed all these terrible crimes has already escaped, while the protagonist on the hole at this time under the balcony. Right after the man from the balcony left, the protagonist decided to come down to earth and was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief because he assumed that he could be caught. In order not to be noticed on the street, the protagonist even decided to put on his face a scarf that he had stolen from the room of the murdered man. At this moment, he also thought about what this young man has to do with the purpose that he had today. At that moment, he suddenly decided to peek from the balcony to see what was going on in that hotel room and climbed back up onto the balcony. After he has done this, as that young man declares that he needs another person in this place, because it would be best if he waits for the help of his comrades, immediately afterward, the guy starts examining the corpse of the main character's target and states that in his opinion, not even half an hour has passed since his death, and he also assumes that the person who did it apparently acted in very cold blood. But suddenly Eugene is surprised that he begins to lick the blood on the throat of the corpse. Suddenly, the guy noticed that someone is peeping at him from the balcony, which naturally scared the protagonist very much. At that moment, he realized that he had been spotted and therefore decided to immediately open up from the balcony by falling to the ground, because he absolutely could not that the person who was upstairs could somehow catch him. But everything was not so simple, and the man who was on top was able to grab the protagonist, which of course surprised him, because he did not understand how this man can be so fast. Immediately afterward, the protagonist was thrown to the ground and kicked while he was shaking all over. Naturally, that young guy looked into Eugene's eyes and immediately asked if it was true that he was the one who had killed all those people in that hotel. But Eugene was as if in a stupor and was not going to answer. Noticing that the young man began to press his foot harder on the protagonist, that completely deprived him of the ability to move. At this point, realizing that Eugene would not say anything, the guy decided to grab him by his clothes. But Eugene realized that in order for him to get out, he needed to hit the young man as meanly as possible and immediately escape. Immediately thereafter, at a moment when he had a good moment, he struck his fist very strongly, smelling this young man, that it for some time naturally immobilized him and rendered him infirm. At this moment, Eugene immediately got up from the ground and fled from the hotel room he was in. But after he ran out, he only wondered if this kind of size eggplant really doesn't prevent this guy from walking. Suddenly, Eugene heard a noise behind his back and turned around to see a policeman who kicked the door of the hotel room. He also said that if he could catch the protagonist, he could consider that he was as dead as his victim. Seeing this, the protagonist was very much frightened and was surprised because he did not understand how this man could do such a thing. Suddenly leaning against the wall, the guy tries to escape from the hotel. Eugene knows that he can't let that young man catch him. At that moment, suddenly that guy's hand is already near Eugene's head. Immediately after that, in order to get revenge on the young vampire who hit him in the groin, the young man hits the protagonist hard with his face against the wall that was nearby. Of course, the protagonist began to feel a lot of pain and was very surprised that he could be caught once again, while the young man himself was very happy that he caught his abuser. Immediately after that, the guy once again slammed the protagonist's head against the wall that was nearby in order for the lesson to be mastered even better. Immediately after this, the protagonist fell to the floor and tried to crawl slowly because he had no strength left for anything else because of the damage he had received. At that moment, the vampire realizes that he needs to hide immediately because this young man must not catch him. As Eugene slowly crawled across the floor, the young man only observed his pathetic existence, and tossing the fire extinguisher away, said that the guy might not even try to escape. Eugene realizes that if this young man catches him, he will most likely beat him to death and thus deprive the young vampire of a life so dear to him. At this time, the guy was holding Eugene down and still asking the same question. It turned out he was still very curious if what had happened was really Eugene's doing. But the vampire again is not going to say anything and only asks to be released and no longer held. At this point, the young man is not clear what came over him and only asked the protagonist to calm down a little. But Eugene naturally wasn't going to do anything of the sort, and once again knocked the young man to the ground and sharply reached for the hydrant. After he managed to get a high-pressure water hose in his hands, Eugene immediately pointed it toward the guy and started pouring water on him, saying that he wouldn't just surrender into his hands. At that moment, the guy decided that Eugene is wild, but Eugene realized that he would not give up because he is a born again. Right after that, Eugene left the hose on Earth and decided to try again. While the hose was wriggling all sorts of things on the floor, Eugene was already on the other balcony. While the young man ordered him to stop immediately, But the vampire, as usual, was not going to obey his orders, and only after sending the guy far away and for a long time decided to jump off the balcony, realizing that he could do it, because he was no longer human. After the young man was able to stop the pressure that came from the hose, he was very unhappy about missing the protagonist. After a while, Eugene was already in the arms of his master, who, stroking his leg, said that in his opinion, the boy's leg was not properly joined. According to him, the leg will probably have to be broken and reassembled in order for it to fuse back together properly. Of course, the master immediately asks if Eugene can handle it, but realizing that the young vampire wasn't capable of inflicting that much pain on himself, he immediately grabbed his leg and broke it again. At this moment, Eugene started screaming in pain and even got all sweaty from what he was experiencing. But the owner only smilingly praised the protagonist, saying that he was able to cope with his mission, at which point the guy asked if he could then get his promised reward. Then the master began to slowly remove the clothes from the guy's shoulders and said that of course he would get his reward, because after all, he had earned it himself. After that, the protagonist began to feel good feelings from the reward he received and realized that he feels a good warmth that feels much better than when he does it alone. Also, Eugene realizes that the better he will do his job, the warmer he will be. The next day, the vampire realizes that in order to do his job even better, he needs to investigate the very young man who last time almost became an obstacle to the mission he received from his master. At this moment, he was at the training of the American soccer team, which was led by the same young man, because Eugene wants to learn as much as possible about him. It turns out that this guy's name is Dominic Reagan, and at the moment he is 22 years old, and his height is 193 centimeters. On the field, he is the starting midfielder of the soccer team of the university where the main character is studying. Knowing all this, Eugene didn't know what he was doing at the hotel and realized he needed to find out what his relationship was with the man he'd killed. Well, suddenly Dominic approaches the protagonist and asks what he wants from him. Then a confident Eugene says he'd like to know something. Naturally, the footballer was not very happy with such a statement and only expressed his displeasure with his facial expression. But immediately after that, he began to distance himself from the protagonist, asking not to annoy him in vain and disappear. But Eugene was not going to give up and shouted to Dominic to talk to him for a while. At that moment, David approaches him from behind and asks what the vampire wants from their ace. Naturally, the protagonist is not impressed by such a meeting or wonders what David has forgotten in this place. It turns out Eugene does not want to be associated with this idiot, but he immediately grabs Dominic's hand and says that they urgently need to talk. When David saw this, he grabbed the protagonist's arm and pulled him to him and asked him what he was doing, and also stated that for his own good, Eugene should not get into their ACS. After saying that, David reached into the back pocket of Eugene's pants with his hand and said that it looked like someone had a present for him from this morning. Immediately afterward, David pulled a toy out of the protagonist's pocket and asked him if the gimmick really belonged to his master. David was also very angry that Eugene, for some reason unknown to David, began to ignore him. At this point, Eugene was only trying to take the toy that was in his back pocket out of David's hands, because according to him, this toy was a gift from his master. Suddenly, at this moment, Dominic comes up to them and grabs David's hand, which naturally surprises David and Eugene, who did not expect that they could attract the ace's attention. Then Dominic looked at the boys and said that if they couldn't decide who the toy belonged to, then maybe they would agree to give him the toy. Naturally, David immediately wondered why Dominic needed this thing, while Eugene was in a lot of pain from Dominic squeezing his hand. Suddenly, Dominic pulls Eugene close to him and hugs him very hard while looking at David's surprised face. He asked why he was so surprised, and if he really thought Dominic was incompetent in this matter. Of course, the main character was very much surprised after hearing these words, while David looked at the situation with incomprehension. Naturally, David immediately started making excuses and said that he didn't mean it at all, while the main character felt like he was some kind of shrimp being squashed by two whales. Right after that, Dominic said that he thought David should go to practice because he assumed that he didn't want to be a cornerback and just run around and miss out on all the fun. At this point before me and looked very serious in his intentions. Naturally, David immediately understood the hint he had received and immediately said that of course he was heading to the training right away. In this case, of course, the guy was completely unhappy with what was happening, but still faced shoulders with Dominic, said that he hopes that the Domic's protagonist will have a good time together. At this time, Eugene began to look out from behind Dominic's body and was very much surprised at David's behavior, for he can't believe that the guy gave up his goal so easily and just left on one order. But it was not to be, and as David was leaving, he looked at Eugene and said that in the future they would face each other and find out who was the strongest, at which time Eugene once again realized how untenable David was. At this time, Dominic squeezed the toy in his hands and pressed the button that was there and suddenly asked Eugene if he really thought that he had nothing else to do. At this time, the main character's thoughts seemed to be confused, and he didn't even know what to answer. Then Dominic looked at the protagonist with a smile and said that he was ready to give him some of his personal time, and remembering that Eugene wanted to ask him something, he allowed the young man to ask him a question. After a while, both guys were already in the locker room of the soccer team, where the protagonist hugged Dominic and realized that everything was happening only because of David's intervention at that moment. Naturally, the main character likes what is happening very much, but he still realizes that he did not come to this place for that, but to talk to Dominic. Suddenly, Dominic remembered where he had seen the protagonist before and stated that perhaps their first meeting had occurred a little earlier in the shower room on Sunday. Naturally, Dominica was right, and at that moment, hugging Eugene said that they could have done it together even then. But the protagonist made a different decision for himself at that moment. Naturally, Dominic became sharply curious as to why, at that point in time, Eugene had decided to leave the two of them alone in the shower and just run away. This surprises Ace a lot, especially since apparently he's already noticed that Eugene isn't the underdog he thought he was. At this point, the protagonist feels pleasure, but also begins to feel some anger, because he heard Dominique laughing for some reason, which drove the protagonist into a dead end. Suddenly, the protagonist says that he would like to learn a little more information about Dominic, because he can do certain things that the protagonist would also like to master. It turns out that some time ago, the main character promised his master that he would prove his love through playing the piano. That's why he wants to learn some secrets to be able to show his love in a different way. But Dominic is still not entirely sure what Eugene means when he says he wants to learn from Dominic the things he knows how to do. Then the protagonist declares that he wants Dominic to teach him how to properly fake love because he needs to win the love of his master. Being in a losing position, Eugene even declares that in return, he is ready to do anything for Dominic because he sees no other way to show his love for his master. At this point, Dominic was very surprised at the request he heard. But then Eugene only stated that that day in the shower room, he realized one very simple thing. It turns out that Eugene immediately noticed that Dominic was with a guy he didn't really like that day, but he still managed to pretend to be in love with him. In Eugene's opinion, anyone who saw this picture would envy Dominic and the abilities he possesses. Naturally, the main character immediately emphasized that he too wants to learn how to show fake love so that the other person doesn't realize it. Naturally, Eugene once again emphasizes that he wants the guys to make a deal immediately. In return, he asks that Dominic promise that it teaches him how to properly fake volutionize. Hearing these words, Dominic thought a little and tried to understand what benefit he would get from these lessons. But suddenly he realizes what he will get in the end. Ace then touched his lips to the main characters and asked if he understood correctly that in return for these lessons, he would be able to do whatever he wanted with Eugene. At this moment, Eugene was a bit startled and immediately wondered why the atmosphere in this room had changed so drastically, from positive to something that confused him. But he didn't have time to get answers to his question, as Dominic suddenly grabbed him sharply by his clothes and started pushing him to the bench that was next to it. Using his physical superiority, Dominic was easily able to bench the protagonist and immediately loomed over him. Naturally, the protagonist is not very happy with what is happening between them, while Dominic himself has said that he's not at all sure that the protagonist can give him everything he wants to get from this kid. That's why Dominic says that now they're going to see if Eugene can fulfill all of Dominic's desires. Hearing these words, Eugene was a little frightened by what was happening and immediately wondered why this young man was being so rude to him. At this point, Dominic is not going to explain anything, and only wonders if their master Eugene is his beloved partner. At this point, the guy began to gently caress the hand of the protagonist, and looking directly into his wife's eyes said that apparently Eugene, as well as he, absolutely does not like his master. Of course, at this point, Eugene tried to somehow justify himself and said that this is not true at all. But Dominic was not going to listen to him, and only asked the protagonist what games they play with their master, and how long they have been partners. Naturally, such words very much embarrassed the protagonist, who even blushed at this question. But gathering his will in a fist, he immediately asked why Dominic asked him about these rather personal things. At this point, Dominique gently touches Eugene's face and says that apparently then in the shower, the protagonist was only pretending to be God's dandelion, but is actually the same as the lodge itself. The AC even suggests that at that moment in time, Eugene was even very curious about how much he could do, at which point Eugene was as red as usual from the shame he was experiencing. Immediately after these words, Dominic suddenly abruptly grabbed the protagonist by the head and began to kiss him passionately. Naturally, at this moment, Eugene himself was not at all opposed to such an outcome, but he still had an awkward feeling. Because as it turned out, because of the too long kiss, Eugene did not have enough air. It was so long that he even began to feel a little dizzy. But at that moment, Dominic felt some unexpected feeling and immediately stopped. It turns out that he found the whole thing very strange, and even asked the protagonist if he had not had such a similar experience with his master before. Dominic wonders if it is true that his master has not kissed him so passionately. After all, he has a strong feeling that he is suffocating for the first time because of the kiss. At this point, the protagonist was still feeling some awkwardness that she was hanging between guys, but thought of Dominique completely. You can't judge people by one kiss. Then, realizing that it is really so, Dominic looked at the protagonist and said that he wants to possess Eugene. While the guy himself looked at Dominic with incomprehension. At the moment when he started to approach him again, the protagonist closed his eyes and thought that it could happen again, and even suddenly realized that Dominic is a very arrogant and selfish person. But even despite his thoughts, the protagonist is still unclear why then, in this case, he feels so good while spending time together with Dominic. After a while of their kiss, Dominic finally stopped and looked at the protagonist and smiled a little. It turns out he did it because he felt the protagonist squeezed his body very hard and pressed against him. Naturally, Dominic immediately started laughing about it and asked Eugene if he really liked the way they were having fun together that much. Of course, hearing these words, the protagonist once again began to deny everything and say that it is not so. But the house immediately touched his forehead to his face, and feeling all the trembling of the protagonist asked how he can still be so naive. At this point, the protagonist only asked Dominic to finally let him go. After a while, they were again on the stadium grounds where Dominic asked, did he correctly realize that the protagonist wanted him to teach him fake love? Then the protagonist didn't hear Dominic's question very well and asked him again, at which point Dominic stated that judging by the fact that the protagonist was still in the clouds after the kiss, things could take a different turn. The young man states that he can easily assume that the protagonist will soon fall in love with him for real, considering how naive and frivolous Eugene is. Immediately after these words, Eugene quickly headed up the stadium while Dominic watched his defiant behavior with surprise. But suddenly, Eugene turned around and told Dominic that he could not even hope for such an outcome. According to the main character, this will not happen, only because his heart already belongs to his master whom he loves so much. But Dominic naturally once again does not believe in his words, and grabbed the protagonist's hand and said that they would be able to see and test it in the future. But for now, he agreed to teach the protagonist how to be in love, asking him to do something for him in return, at which point they shook hands. Suddenly, right after that, Dominic says that he suggests that they start practicing kissing right away. Hearing these words, the protagonist tried to immediately escape from the place, saying that they will start practicing from tomorrow. At this time in the estate and the master of the protagonist, his subject informs the master that he was able to get important information and told all that has happened to the protagonist recently. Naturally, the master listened carefully to his subordinate and drew conclusions from all of the above. He realized that his baby was spending his time with another man in his absence. Plus, at that moment, his subordinate said that it was just like that, but immediately emphasized that at that moment he immediately remembered his father, who is the master. Naturally, and just like that, The owner's rather calm reaction is surprising, and that's why the subordinate immediately wonders if the owner should have been very angry about what happened. But the man was just thinking about something, and turned around and asked that his subjects from now on just keep an eye on how Jin would behave, and how he would spend his time when he was not near his master. Naturally, his subject is very surprised at such an order, and so ventures to inquire why this child in the person of Eugene is so strongly attracted to the master. According to the subordinate, he did not understand why their commander-in-chief was treating Eugene like this, because he had already shown that he did not like his master at all. At this moment, the man was just listening attentively to these words. At that moment, he smiled broadly and asked his subject, why should he lose what he could always gain? According to him, there is value in conquering the impossible. At this moment, suddenly hears someone else's voice and the master and his subject turn around. It turns out another man who is also here said that the master very coolly said these words. At the same time, the man stressed that he was of the same opinion and emphasized that such behavior is more inherent to the average person, because it is a human trait to challenge the impossible. Seeing this man, the owner immediately said hello to him and called him Mr. Shalon, but in response, the man only reminded the owner that he had already asked many times to call him just Caleb. At that moment, Caleb took a glass with blood which was on the tray of the master's subject, and saying that it was getting hot in here, said that he would rather go outside for some fresh air. Immediately after saying that, he drank the entire glass of blood he had taken, and only said that it would be perfectly fine if there was also a bucket of ice in the place. At this point, the owner said that Callie could rest easy, and he would go check the ventilation system in the meantime. But Caleb was quite opposed to this, and declared that such things could be handled by a subject of the master. Naturally, the subject immediately realized he needed to get out of the place quickly to check the ventilation system, and said he was ready to follow orders. At this point, the host and Caleb were alone, and Caleb said that in any case, the pastor had organized a very nice reception. According to Caleb, the first time he saw this place, he did not expect the fact that the reception that was organized here would be so cool. Hearing these nice words in his direction, the pastor smiled and stated that at that time he was just getting settled with all his estates. According to him at the time, Caleb was also very young. Upon hearing these words, Caleb stated that it was like that, and it was even before he got on the internet. According to Caleb, he hopes very much that since that time the pastor's life has become much better, because according to his own words, if to be completely frank, few people managed to personally meet his father. Then the pastor immediately stated that naturally it was a great honor for him, and it had helped him a lot in his time. In response to this, Caleb said that thanks to the fact that his family had helped the pastor, they could now live in peace. Naturally, the pastor immediately said that Caliber was just flattering him, but the man said that in those days he had really learned a lot from the pastor. According to him, the pastor had done many graceful and courageous things, and it was a great help to gain experience. Immediately afterward, Caleb declares that these lessons were fundamentally different from what he had learned from his father. And the best part, he thinks, is that no one at the banquet has any idea what the pastor is doing when the sun disappears over the horizon. Immediately after these words, the pastor says he had a small request for the Caliban, but suddenly heard a door that was open. Naturally, the pastor immediately stopped his conversation with Caleb and turned his attention to what was happening nearby. There he saw the main character who wore the same clothes as all the other servants of the master. After a few seconds, Eugene came up to the men and asked his master if he had really prepared this suit for him, because it fit him perfectly. So the guy even thanked his master for it. But the pastor just told Caleb that they should postpone their conversation a little bit and continue it a little bit later, at which time Caleb and the protagonist changed their faces a lot, as if something had happened. Then Caleb said that naturally they could do it a little later and watch the pastor lead the protagonist away. As Eugene and his master were moving away, the young man said that the gift he had received from his master was still in his possession, and also emphasized that all day his thoughts were only of his master. But then the pastor stopped the protagonist and stated that the young man was lying as usual. Right after that, the pastor pinned the protagonist behind one of the pillars. Eugene is naturally very much frightened by such an unexpected reaction of his master, but he immediately asked the protagonist not to be afraid, because according to him, even despite all the lies and deceit that the protagonist says he does not care, The pastor declares that no matter what such sins of the young man, he will always love him. While Caliber is still outside the door looking at the empty corridor where it seems as if there is no one else, suddenly a man appears next to Caleb and asks if Caleb has said everything he needs to say to the pastor. But he only says that he hasn't done it yet because he still has a lot of time, because the night is very long. At this point, the man interrupted the guy and said that he wasn't going to wait long because he didn't see any point in talking to a bunch of drug addicts about anything. And he said that if he just wanted to talk to the pastor, he could just attend the service. At that moment, Cale takes another glass of blood, and throwing some kind of pill into it says that his father can go home, and he wants to stay a little longer here. After some time, the pastor along with the protagonist were already in the bedroom where the master stated that David was surprisingly right. At this point, Eugene was completely tied up, but the host immediately emphasized that David had already informed him that the protagonist was with another man, and even though he was well aware of the reward the host could give him, after they and interesting time together, the host announced that he had to go to Europe for a few weeks. Of course, Eugene was a bit surprised at such words, and wondered how he should deal with the university in such a case, at which time the host looked at him with incomprehension, but immediately looked at the young man and asked if he really wanted them to go to Europe together, a question that surprised Eugene, because he had originally assumed that it would be so. Then the host said that this was impossible because Eugene needed to continue attending university, but the young man balked and said he wanted to go with his host. On what he heard, a sharp refusal because according to the host, it is absolutely impossible and because he already has a companion in this journey. Hearing these words, the main character was very much upset, but immediately decided to ask who is the companion of his master during this journey, on what he heard a very unexpected answer, because it turned out that together with the pastor on this journey will go to Caleb Shalom. Hearing this name, Eugene became very alert and started hugging his master and asked him why he should not go to Europe alone. But he immediately said that in any case, he would call his master every day if he went alone, so that he would not get bored. Then the pastor just smiled a little and said that the matter had been settled and was not up for discussion. And he said that while he was away, Eugene should be a goody-goody around here. It was after this conversation, the master. I left the protagonist alone and went to Europe, of course. The protagonist was not happy about what happened, because he thought that the master just left him alone and left with Caleb. At the moment when Eugene was sad, Dominic suddenly came up to him and handed him a pink ice cream. Of course, the protagonist did not expect Dominic to come up to him. Then Dominic immediately asked what was going on with the young man, while he looked very angry, and asked if Dominic really thought of him as some kind of dog. But Dominic was not going to give up, and said that he was sighing so heavily that it had become impossible to concentrate on anything else. Right after that, he touched the ice cream to his nose, wondering if he had learned it from him. At that moment, Eugene took the ice cream in his hands and realized that it was meant for him. It turns out the protagonist had to go through a lot to find out who Dominic really is, but in the end, he still managed to get information about him. But this information was not unusual, and as it turned out, Dominic was just an ordinary guy. At this point, Eugene began to remember how he spent his free time with the famous, and suddenly he began to realize that all the training that had taken place and the relationship that was building between him and Dominic was more like a very ordinary couple's date than anything else. So yes, Eugene decided to ask Dominic if he should not train him better in order for the protagonist to also succeed in fake love. But hearing these words, Dominic was very much surprised. At this point, he even asked Eugene if he really didn't have enough of all the lessons he had already received from him. At which point, Eugene stated without any doubt that it was indeed true, and he was completely lacking in lessons. Then Dominic smiled and said that if everything is really so, he is ready to give another lesson, and suddenly grabbed the main character's hand and started to drag him somewhere, from which he even lost his ice cream. When Dominic said that if the protagonist still lacked the training he had already received during this time, they should move to a more serious level. Hearing these words, the protagonist watched Dominic with surprise. After a while, both guys ended up in the public library of the university they attend, where Dominic started flipping through some book while Eugene just watched the whole thing. During his observation, Eugene looked very angry and offended, because he did not understand why they came here and immediately asked what they were going to do in the library. But then Dominic said that first, the main character should just choose a book, as Dominic did. Naturally, noticing that Eugene does not show any initiative, Dominic began to push him to the protagonist to quickly decide on the book he wants to choose. But the protagonist only thought that he has no time for such nonsense. It turns out all this time he is most embarrassed by the fact that he did not go to Europe in the form of the main character believes that it is his place to be next to the master. Eugene is very much concerned about this, as thoughts enter his head that perhaps the host might have fallen in love with Caleb. The protagonist even decides that if this is really true, he will not be able to survive this tragic event. But suddenly Dominic distracts the protagonist and wonders if he's finally able to choose a book. Naturally, right after that, the protagonist took the book, which he decided to read, and going after Dominic again began to think about his master, and wondered if he could also look at him warmly. After a while, they reached a table somewhere Dominic was all interested in reading the book he had chosen, while the main character looked very confused right after reading the title of the book. Naturally, he realized that he had nothing to hope for, but it turns out that he chose a book that is about love under contract, and which is essentially a love story. At this time, Dominic Sinstom was flipping through pages from his book, while the protagonist began to get very annoyed by the whispers that were emitting from the pages of Dominic's book. Naturally, Eugene immediately decided that Dominic was not helping him at all with this task, but nevertheless, he realizes that he can't give up until he learns more information about Dominic. At which point, a picture pops into his head of Dominic licking the blood of the corpse that was the protagonist's target. After a while, the protagonist suddenly plumped right on the table, because as it turned out from the fact that he was completely uninterested in such a pastime, he even fell asleep. Well, suddenly the protagonist woke up, and looking more carefully at the title to it, suddenly wondered if this novel is not the one that advised to read the professor. It turns out, based on this book, even made a movie that was able to collect 10 million viewers, because it is a story about unhealthy relationships. The main character is also aware of this, and even knows that it is a masterpiece works on which last year even made a movie. But as he began to read the book that the protagonist chose, he began to realize that the story that is described in this novel is rather childish. In his opinion, even the storyline is very boring, and the main character who is presented in this novel is very stupid. At this time, Dominic's hand is gradually approaching the main character. Apparently, the main character decided that if the main character in the novel wasn't sure about the relationship from the beginning, he didn't need to get into it. At which time, Dominic's hand had already dropped under the table. Immediately afterward, Dominic gently touched many of the protagonist, which naturally he was immediately cheered up and very much surprised by it. According to the main character, Dominic, who promised him to teach him fake love, has already completely lost his fear. Naturally, the protagonist is most worried about the fact that maybe someone is watching them and someone noticed the way in the hands of his teacher lowered on his leg. At that moment, having strange feelings, Eugene grabbed Dominic's hand and asked him to remove his hand immediately. But then Dominic countered by saying that the protagonist himself said that he didn't get enough of what he already got, and so he should teach him a little more. At this moment, Eugene was still completely disagreeing with these words, have immediately asked what Dominic was going to teach him at this place. But then Dominic said that in this period of time, he wanted to teach the protagonist to feel at least something. Hearing these words, Eugene even turned his head. But suddenly Dominic says that he can't understand only one thing. It turns out that the guy still doesn't understand why Eugene needs all this, and he even suggests that maybe it's for playing the piano. At the same time, Dominic immediately smashed this version, stating that most likely those who play musical instruments are only in love with them. But then the main character says that he can't convey love by playing the piano, at which point he looks like he's very uncomfortable with everything that's going on, but he still gathers his will in his fist and says that he tries to interpret everything in his own way, but it is naturally quite insufficient. Naturally, he also says that all this is happening even though he has a man whom he loves very much in the person of his master. Hearing these words, Dominic thought a bit and began to make sense of the main character's words. In Dominic's opinion, the protagonist behaves very naively because he does not consider his master just a partner for such games, and himself a real lover. At this point, in order to understand what the protagonist was really thinking, he asked what was next in their story. But then the protagonist said that he wanted to know how others show their love. Naturally, Dominic finally began to understand everything and asked a question and so worried, he immediately asked whether the main character really chose him for that reason, and even decided that he was the best option. Eugene, in turn, said that it was really true, because the emotions he saw in the shower were completely atypical for him. At this point, the protagonist again thought about the fact that he too wanted to be able to express his love like this. At this point, Dominic looked at him with a smile and simply thanked him for his trust. But at the same time, he suddenly said that he was ready to say something very important to the protagonist, and then said that love is the same for everyone, at which point Eugene was very surprised. But suddenly, Dominic continues his monologue and emphasizes that at first, just one look is enough to be happy, and one touch to make the heart start beating more often. But at the same time, with time, everything changes, and any people's feelings begin to cool down slowly. And all that remains is momentary pleasure that people can get together. Dominic also emphasizes that, among other things, the book that the protagonist has chosen is about something like this. But the protagonist still resists the words of his mentor and declares that he is completely wrong. After all, according to Eugene, there is still true love in the world that will live forever. According to him, this is the kind of love he craves, and he does not want to receive any other manifestation of feelings. At that moment, Dominic looked at his ward with surprise, but immediately laughed, saying that he could say whatever he wanted. After all, in his opinion, if the protagonist really thinks so, it only means that he should not give in to the temptation he feels when he is with Dominic. So he said that's exactly what happened, and that's why he asked Dominic to let him go immediately. But Dominic, instead of letting the protagonist go, decided to unzip his fly and prove him wrong once again. Dear friends, and if you want to see the continuation of this story, let's collect under it 5,000 likes or 40,000 views. And to make it happen faster, share this video with your friends who may also like it, and do not forget to write comments to promote.